Hey everybody, it's Professor Keegan back with our final video lecture for WGS 225, Gender and Popular Culture. Um, this week we are looking at Mad Max Fury Road as our final text. A number of you have selected this to write about or produce video essays about. Um, I've been I've been looking at your research bibliographies and thinking about what is the most helpful way to discuss this film because it is quite complex as a text. And I've decided rather than discussing it as an action film, which it is, I would actually explain a bit about science fiction as a genre. Science fiction is not a body genre, so I'm kind of deviating from our course structure a bit here. But I do think that because Mad Max Fury Road is actually a science fiction critique of action as a genre with particular conventions, talking about science fiction will be the most useful thing to help those of you who are analyzing this film build arguments about it. So that is what I'm going to do in this video. Okay, let's get started. So to talk about science fiction, we first have to talk about a category of genres called speculative genres. These are genres including science fiction, fantasy, and horror, which we've already taken a look at. Horror is a body genre as well. Science fiction and fantasy are not body genres necessarily. But they are genres that contain an element of futurism, the supernatural, or the fantastic. So when we say speculative, we mean that they ask a big what if question, right? What if the world was like this, or like this, or like this? They introduce something that does not exist in our current moment, right? So these genres speculate or ask questions about how the reality or the future might be different, often to critique our current world. Okay, so the question is asked in order to think critically about conditions that exist in our current moment. Okay, so even though they're about these far-flung futures or second worlds where the rules of reality are different, ultimately they are about shortcomings of the actual world. Okay, we can see that really clearly with Get Out, right? Which is uses sort of hyperbolic structures of unbelievable violence to actually get at the problem of racism and the unaddressed traumatic violence of the slave trade, right? So Get Out is a critique of our current world. Due to these qualities, speculative genres are often used by oppressed groups to imagine alternative futures. So there are huge fandoms, queer fandoms for science fiction and fantasy. There's feminist science fiction and fantasy. There's also Afrofuturism, which is a Black science fiction genre that imagines a future in which there's no longer a history of enslavement for Black people, and they have this much more advanced society because that never took place, right? Black Panther being the obvious, like, most popular example of Afrofuturistic sort of cinema in our current moment, right? Or Wakanda Forever, the new one. So speculative genres are important to our class because they tend to be taken up by populations that actively want the world to be different and actively have a critique of current conditions and use the genre as a way to explore those critiques. So let's lay out the basic questions each of these genres asks. So we already covered horror as a body genre, one that seeks to produce a bodily response of fear, right, and sweat. Horror, as we talked about, tends to be concerned with repression and the trauma of the modern age. All the things we push down in order to have the society that we have, the civilized society, which is actually a quite violent society. Horror is especially concerned with the violence that is obscured within the structures of the nuclear family, as well as obscured by capitalism. In Get Out, it's also about how whiteness obscures the violence of slavery, right? And the violence inherent to the process of creating Blackness as an idea. So in horror, the major political question being asked is, what are the actual sources of violence in our culture? We're taught that serial killers are the sources of violence, or strangers. But the actual sources of violence are actually far more ubiquitous and systemic. Capitalism, whiteness, right? Heterosexuality is a huge source of violence. And those things are very normalized. So horror helps us see through that normalization to the actual violence caused by structural realities. Fantasy is a little different. Fantasy tends to be concerned with escapism, idealism, and enchantment, i.e., the use of fantastical elements to produce a feeling of wonder or awe. So if in horror you're scared, in fantasy you're like, whoa, that's so cool, right? You're kind of blown away by something that doesn't exist in our current world, right? Harry Potter is a great example of fantasy. And so the major political question asked by fantasy is like, why do we desire to escape reality in the first place? Why do we desire to have this experience of wonder? Why isn't the current world wonderful, right? Because it's oppressive, because it constrains us in all these ways that we naturalize, but that fantasy wakes us up from. We wake up like Sleeping Beauty from the sort of induced slumber of reality when we watch fantasy, right? And then science fiction, which we're focusing on in this lecture, it tends to be concerned with the extension of current ideas into the future in advanced form. So science fiction basically is just like a fast forward button, right? It's like whatever exists in this current moment, hit fast forward and see what it turns into. If the systems aren't disrupted, what will happen in the future? Where are we going? Where are we heading? And so in science fiction, the primary speculative question is like, where might our current world lead if we don't intervene? So you can see how science fiction is oriented toward problem solving, problem solving directed at things in the present that we can't quite understand are about to be looming threats. That's basically what science fiction is attached to. So for example, Star Wars, fantasy. Star Trek, science fiction. That's all you need to know, okay? So to go over a bit of content from last week, horror and fantasy, because they place so much emphasis on the overdetermining structure of reality, kind of constraining individuals, therefore wanting to understand the actual sources of violence or wanting to escape the world, right? Fantasy and horror tend to be melodramatic, whereas science fiction, because it's about problem solving, it's about the individual's challenge to solve advanced problems that arise from old mistakes that have gotten way out of control in the future. Because it's not focused on magic or violence, but on problem solving and cause and effect relationships, science fiction tends to be realist. Okay? It's about individuals first working on the problem of the world versus the problem of the world working on the individual. So I'm going to talk a little bit about fantasy and how it world builds, and then we'll focus on science fiction. So world building in speculative genres is an aesthetic and narrative process through which a speculative text creates an alternative or alternate reality for us, okay? So this can be the creation of imaginary geographies, countries, cultures, bodies, species, other phenomena that create a constructed world, a world that is clearly not our world, but a different world, right? In fantasy, constructed worlds contain supernatural elements that are distinctly different from our world. So we call fantasy as a second world genre, meaning it proposes a world completely different from our own. And we know it's different because there are things present in it that literally cannot exist according to the rules of our reality, right? Like a great one is just magic. If there's magic, then you're pretty much always in a fantasy universe. So this is why in fantasy we so often get like the map of a second world. Like if you think about Lord of the Rings or this example of Westeros from Game of Thrones, right? We get situated in a world that is clearly not ours. And the genre does a lot of work to make sure we understand that this world is completely different in many ways from our world. It's not a future version, it's not a past version, it's an entirely different space. Okay. These constructed fantasy worlds are revealed as constructed in two ways in fantasy. One, the normal rules that would apply in our reality become revealed to not work. So this could be someone like thinking they're losing air in their air suit and then tearing off their suit and realizing they can breathe, right? And being like, wait a minute, that shouldn't be the case. Or realizing they can fly suddenly, right? Like the normal rules of our world no longer apply. And that reveals that we're in a very different space and place, right? Or there's magic, meaning there are entirely new rules that work differently from World 1. We're now in World 2, okay? In Game of Thrones, for a while, it's not clear how high the fantasy is until we realize the depth of kind of the fact that dragons existed and still do exist, right? And that there is magic associated with that. And that's kind of revealed very slowly, as well as the White Walkers above the wall, who are an entirely different sort of speculative fantasy species that is coming back. So the world is becoming more fantastical all the time in Game of Thrones. So how is science fiction different from fantasy? Fantasy suspends the rules of the current world, right? Current world works a certain way, and fantasy says, nope, actually, it actually works like this, okay? Science fiction instead extends present ideas or conditions into imaginary futures. So the basic scientific rules of the world remain the same as our world. It's just that we've gone way past the point of our understanding what the effects are going to be. Okay? So fantasy is like Control Alt Delete and then build something entirely new and reveal that you're in a different space. Science fiction is a fast forward button. Okay? So science fiction uses the principles of cause and effect. It's very cause and effect based to explore how the current world might develop over time into the speculative scenario we find ourselves in. So science fiction is commenting on the implications of our current ideologies or conditions by forcing them forward into alternate environments and time periods where they've become much more complex, much more pressing, much more violent, much more dangerous often than they are in the current moment. But the implications of them exist now. Right. So in something like The Matrix, we see how the implications of digital technology and the sort of internet get turned into an entire future where people live in an imaginary reality that they can't tell isn't real, right? That is science fiction because it extends the implications of things like the internet and virtual reality into an entire world where they've completely taken over. So we could say that science fiction amplifies the underlying assumptions of the present. It doesn't suspend them the way that fantasy does. It actually makes them more obvious, makes them more powerful than they are in the current moment. How does world building in science fiction work? In science fiction, constructed worlds are often more obvious than in fantasy. It's very obvious to us immediately, oh, we're in the future, right? Oh, like this is our world, but many, many iterations later, because look at how these things have gotten more complex and more developed, right? Fantasy often reveals that we're in an entirely different world, whereas science fiction it's immediately obvious that we're far into the future often. And it will tell you, like in Star Trek, it tells you star date, blah, 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 right? It's always telling you, oh, this is our current world, but fast forwarded, right? So again, if in fantasy we have second world things that can't exist in our current world according to our own understanding of science, in science fiction, we have elements that are projections or evolutions of things that exist now. that have evolved from our current moment. So in Alien, right? The entire Alien franchise is a meditation on the development of like hyper-capitalist neoliberal corporate structures, and how the alien monsters are secondary. The real monster in Alien is the corporation that allows the alien to be developed as a weapon and escape, and Ripley, Sigourney Weaver, finds herself locked in a battle with the effects of the corporation as a kind of unpoliced entity that is just wreaking havoc on the natural order of things, right? That is a meditation on the development of the corporation and neoliberal capitalism in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Boom, right? So in science fiction, we have a world ordered by clear cause and effect relationships, or thesis conclusion logics explored through one, either explication to outsiders. So there's often a scene where a newcomer is like, what's the deal with blah, blah, blah? And then all the other characters are like, here's the deal with blah, blah, blah. And this often can happen even on like with an animated sequence or scientists explaining the problem and drawing it out. It's called the whiteboard scene in science fiction, where we get told how we've arrived at the problem that is presenting based on past conditions. Or there's a clear problem-solving process going on in the text about how to resolve the cause and effect chains that have gotten out of control. Now, Mad Max has a whiteboard scene. It opens with a little bit of a whiteboard scene where it tells you how the world that exists came to be, right? So we are in a science fiction universe where the current conditions are an extension of past conditions that are explained. And the whole film is a problem-solving adventure, right? It's about solving the fundamental problem of a resource being entirely controlled by one person. So Immortan Joe controls the water. Because he controls the water, he can do whatever the hell he wants. And he's doing things, right? He's doing really, really nasty things because he has a capitalist monopoly on a fundamental resource. So the whole movie is about, in some ways, problem solving about monopoly. Okay. And it takes a cast of characters with different skills to actually address this monopoly. Star Trek is always about this. Every Star Trek episode is there's a problem and the Federation has to solve it by working together across difference to address conditions that have gotten out of hand because of cause and effect relationships from the past, blah, right? So as if you're choosing, I mean, I'm having you write about Mad Max a bit on your own, regardless, in the journals, or discussions. But if you're writing on this film particularly, there are some things you could consider here, right? As a science fiction text, I think there are a lot of things going on in Mad Max that are critiques. They're critiques of things in our current world. So the film may seem like it's far off into a distant future, but the things it's addressing and its problem solving are here and now. That's important to understand as a science fiction text. So if science fiction is ultimately about our own world, then what is this film critiquing about present conditions? We have a world that is ruined, right? This world is barely habitable. We have a cult. We have a cult produced because one very powerful person controls a resource, right? And we have all of the class and gender implications of that control. So an entire social order is laid out before us in a reflection of kind of current ideas about gender, sexuality, and economy, right? Think about when the movie came out. You should be doing that research, because science fiction is often a critique of the society that existed when it is created. So when did this film get made? What were the present political conditions, right? Okay. Secondarily, the film is revising on the typical conventions of action cinema, which are, I mean, we've all seen these movies, right? There's like a dude, he's highly skilled, he just like is fighting bad guys, and ultimately he wins. And it's like a story of the individual, singular, masculine hero who's, so hyper skilled and so ahead of the game that he can outmaneuver all the forces that oppose him, right? And he's unquestionably the good guy, right? That's the narrative with action cinema. And action cinema is often very nationalist in that the bad guys are bad because they're from other countries and the good guy is good because he's from our country, right? So this is a movie without countries. Countries are over in Mad Max Fury Road, right? Like there aren't the conditions possible to even have countries. What we have left is like pseudo-religious fanatical cults. That's all that exists. And then people dealing with that reality. This world has become tribal. Um, but Max is not the Max of the first Mad Max movies anymore. He's not just this hero who can do anything and beat anybody, right? Like, what is the film saying about the role of the singular action hero in this future where that's not enough anymore? Okay. So be thinking about that. Who is Immortan Joe? The bad guy, the cult leader? What does he symbolize? What is he doing? What are the things around him that he's doing? Does that map onto anything in our current world? Consider, right? Traditional gender norms of men acting and women appearing are problematized in this film. So how is that happening and why? Okay. Could we say this is a feminist science fiction action film? And if we're making that claim, why is it? How are individuality and collectivity working here? We have one form of collectivity, the cult, and we have another form of collectivity, which is like the team of people working together to defeat the cult and its worship. Okay. And how does that map onto critiques of, say, capitalism versus socialism, possibly? And there's a whole structure in this movie about we're going forward to try to escape to a perfect place, and then the realization halfway through the movie that that place no longer exists. And the second half of the film is them going right back to where they came from. What are the politics of saying, actually, you can't just get out, right? And you need to actually confront the problem, right? That is we're teased through the first half of the movie with the idea that there will be another place, a place where these conditions don't exist. And then halfway through, it's revealed that no, there is no place where these conditions don't exist. What does that then require of the team of people, of us as viewers, right? The stakes change. What does that do to the politics of the film? Lastly, we need to think about an entire cult where everyone is painted white. And we need to think about how there are so many representations of disability in this future where the most of the water is toxic, the world is irradiated, a lot of people have disabled bodies in one way or another. And how is that presented? Is that important to the story? Okay. So just a few things to think about, like I said, we saved this for the end, and I do think in many ways this film is probably the most complex primary text that we've looked at as a group, and that's why I saved it for last. I also think it's a really amazingly fun movie to watch, right? With incredible world building that tells us a lot about the politics of this world and the power struggle that we're watching unfold. Okay, so I'll be looking forward to seeing what you think of this film in the discussions. I will be very much looking forward to receiving your projects, papers, etc. By noon on the 16th, which is this coming Friday. If you have issues with anything, please let me know. We can email, we can set up a meeting, okay? But yeah, if you're getting stuck, if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out. It's been wonderful having you as a class, and I wish you the best of luck with your work. All right.